Well, for more on Martin Luther King's economic message, I'm joined by Reverend Edward L. Anderson. He's a social activist and co-organizer of Trust Talks LA. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, most of the focus on Dr. King's legacy focused on his social and civil rights contributions and less so on his fight for economic justice. What kind of America did King have in mind economically?
I believe King had an America that everyone could have food, everyone could have a living wage, and people could afford housing and health care. That's the America that we don't talk about often. And in fact, before King was assassinated on April the 4th, 1968, he gave a speech about the other America. And he talked about how we need to have an investment in housing, an investment in our communities, and making sure everyone has a livable wage.
And certainly this concept of being left behind is something that we're seeing today. So talk to us about King's economic goals of the Poor People's Campaign and how we're seeing it revived in recent years.
The original Poor People's Campaign demanded that we have $30 billion reinvested into the American public, that we have like a wartime mobilization, and that we have 500,000 affordable housing units built across the country, that healthcare be expanded, and that everyone has a guaranteed income, that where we couldn't have jobs before, that we create new jobs so that everyone can have a livable wage and dignity, and that no work would be menial.
And how does that compare to some of the challenges that we're seeing today in terms of poverty and the sorts of rights that people still need access to?
Oh, much hasn't changed. I mean, right now in America, about 140 million people are poor. That's about 1 out of every 2 people. 1 out of every 5 children are dealing with poverty. They can't feed themselves. They don't know if they're going to have food at night. They are making decisions. We have unions fighting to be unionized and for $15 of a minimum wage because they need a livable wage. Most home care workers who King fought with and was talking to before he was killed still make below minimum wage. They can't afford to put food on the table, let alone take care of their loved ones. And so poverty is an issue that we don't talk about in America. We like to show our grand consumerism, like to show how nice we are in Hollywood, but poverty is a real issue, that people can't afford to buy shoes and dresses here, people can't afford to have a livable wage, and they can't afford rent. And so if we can't afford rent, and then how are we being a true country with an American dream? It's now like an American illusion.
Now, we know that Dr. King talked about the radical redistribution of economic and political power. So what was it about his economic message that his critics were most threatened by?
I think they knew that he could actually win. That if people actually had a guaranteed income, if people actually had jobs that paid livable wages, that there would be a radical shift in America, that the morality of America could be redeemed, and that means that those who had the 1% in America would have to pay their fair share. The corporations who get tax breaks will have to reinvest in the schools and communities which they take that money from. And people really feared that. They feared the change. They feared that America could be a place where even the most least of these, that Black and brown people in this country have been discriminated against for so long, would be in their boardrooms. They would be able to have good lives and thrive. And people feared that because they needed someone to be the other in this country. And that was a failing of our morality in this nation.
Now, we saw that in Dr. King's last Sunday sermon before his assassination, he talked about the triple revolution. Now, that was a technological revolution, a revolution of weaponry, and the human rights revolution. Especially in this political climate, why is it important to look at the impact of all 3 of these issues simultaneously?
It's important because all 3 of these issues are interlocking justices, right? So we have enough technology in this nation to help solve poverty. The UN reporter came and said that America is one of the richest nations, most industrialized nations, but it's also one of the most impoverished nations. And so King really understood that these are interlocking injustices, and that if we had human rights, if we had saw poverty saw economic Bill of Rights as a human right, if we saw that people having a livable wage was a human right, that people having a job is a human right, people being able to feed their children is a human right, if we was able to do that, then we would really change the narrative of our nation. And right now, this is where we are at, and this is why people are trying to revive the Poor People's Campaign today.
All right, thank you so much for your insights, Reverend Edward L. Anderson there of Trust Talks LA and the LA Voice.